See if I can hit the right button this time. I tell you, these things just come up different every single time. Okay. Ah. Hmm. Yeah. Maybe we'll get going here in a minute. Okay. I think we got it. Been our first time having a Wednesday, and then we'll probably be skipping the next couple Wednesdays. So we'll get one back in the book. We had been talking about, and I kind of label this on my YouTube thing, discipleship, but these lessons follow me, and it's about discipleship. And I just think about these things a lot. Jesus didn't ask us, if you guys aren't doing nothing, follow me. This is a command. Follow me. Make disciples. And a disciple, I could tell you a disciple, and I hope we're all disciples, it means a learner. You think about that, because it's real easy to get, I got it all figured out, or I know all the doctrine. And honestly, we are to ever be learning, discovering Christ. That's what, because when you don't, then to me, you're no longer a learner. That doesn't mean you graduated, you just quit following. So we have kind of gone through this other 8 lessons, and I know these next 2 are going to be tough, I guess. Stretching our brains on how to think. And I know when I started this lesson, I read this one scripture. I read it again. I read it again. I read it again. And I said, well, maybe I'll read it, and then I don't know. But this lesson is about temptation. Temptation. And honestly, how can following Jesus not involve temptation? Jesus, right out of the gate, he gets baptized. What happens? He's led by the Spirit, driven by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tested. And, he succeeds where Adam failed. He succeeds where Israel failed, because when Israel comes out of Egypt, where do they go? Straight into the wilderness. And what happened? They failed. These died in the wilderness, right? They failed. But he succeeds. And the scripture I looked at was Matthew 13. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. I want to hold off on that. But what I want to do here, and I don't even know if I got any Bible verses. Yeah, I do. But we've got to get the question of temptation into its proper theological context. We've been on our lesson on Sundays, the revolution of the cross, and, getting things in the right context, not what we kind of been brought up to think. Now, as we do this, now we're thinking of temptation here. What's the normal Christian, Western Christian theological thinking of temptation? Well, we see Jesus go into the wilderness and the devil is tempting him, make these stones bread and, all of this stuff. So we kind of get this idea that Satan, the bad guy, he's tempting. So with us, Satan comes creeping along and he's there to tempt you, right? I mean, that's what he does. We got to fight them devils and all of that stuff. We had a question come in on our radio show the other day, and it was talking about the armor of God. Put on the armor of God, and looking back at all the wars, Israel's battles in the Old Testament, and the person says, was those battles types and shadows of the battles that we fight, and as Christians nowadays? And then you go read the verse, put on the whole armor of God. And I said, let's look at this verse real quick. What does it say? Put on the whole armor of God so that you can what? Fight? No, so that you can stand. I said, let's read it again. Put on the whole armor of God so that you can stand. Not fight, stand. And I explained to them, in the Marine Corps, we put our dress blues on. How many Marines, you didn't see them dress blues, hitting the beach at Iwo Jima. Yeah, no, that's a dress uniform. And we put on Christ because we already have the victory, and we stand in. So the temptation would be for us to move out of the victory, right? Not fighting all this other stuff. But again, we're talking temptation here. One of the hardest things to get a hold of in the Bible is the place of Satan. Ask 99% of Christians in the Western context, Western church, what do we do with Satan? What's the first thing they're going to tell you? Well, he's an angel. He was up in heaven and he got kicked out, right? I mean, Satan was up in heaven. He rebelled against God. God kicked him out. We kind of think of him as this arch opponent. But the real shocker is to discover and read in the book of Job that he's one of God's servants. I mean, you go read the book of Job. Well, we don't have to tear out the book of Job because, Job can only do what God allows him to do. I mean, what's he say? You've put a hedge around him. I can't even get to him. I mean, he's nowhere in the book of Job seen as the arch enemy, the arch opponent of God, because God has no arch enemy or opponent, if you will. But just as we are trying to get our minds around that, and what that might mean, we discover that he's a rebellious servant. And this goes back to what we were talking about early about things being out of order, the things that we were trying to establish in our revolution of the cross, how God has set things up, but when they're out of order, then we have chaos and we have a mess. So the reason it's hard for us to think about temptation, think about Satan, and think about all of these things is because we like to keep things simple. We would like to live in a world without evil. One of the questions that came in we haven't got to answer, then why did God allow the serpent to get into the garden? Why didn't he close the gate? I mean, if God knew, why, what's going on? So we got, all these questions. We just think we would like things to be more simple, a world without evil. But that's not the case. We'd settle for a world where everything was clear cut, but it's simply not that way. I mean, go back and look at Genesis 1. And how does Genesis 1 end? Everything that God made was good and very good. And I would say, well, did God mess up? I mean, you got to wrestle with these questions a little bit. We don't like to wrestle. Well, God made them good, and then, this. God said everything is good. Everything. So, well, our minds try to get around that. That's why sports are so popular. Maybe not with everybody here, but I know 3 it's probably real popular with. Because we know who to pull for. And if you don't know, I'll tell you. But we like it this way. This team is our team, which makes the other team the enemy. We like it that way. It's cut and dry. The team in the blue jerseys are the good guys. The team in the green jerseys are the bad guys. We got it. And then if our team is an underdog, even better. That's what we want life to be like. We watch sports because it allows us the luxury of this clear-cut dualism, right? Good guy, bad guy. Fighting devils, that's what we like. And we like that because in the world we live in, it's not that clear-cut, is it? It's not. I told you before we went on the air about a dilemma you're in. Do I go over to the table? Do I not go over to the table? What do you say? I wish it was clear cut. I got a text message and says, go over here and say these magic words and everything's going to be all right. It just doesn't happen. Maybe it does to other people, but it don't happen to me. Because that's one thing you realize as you get older is the realization that nothing is as straightforward as it once seemed. And I say that to say the trouble with most views of temptation is that we're always hoping that Christianity will more like sports. Well, it'll be more like sports and less like real life. And preachers kind of follow Paul and, with this appeal to this kind of sports mindset. Hey, and what does he say? There's a race to be run, and you want to win that race, don't you? There's a race. You got to fight the good fight, and you got to keep on. You got to keep on. Well, that's fine when you're young and strong. You think there's a chance you might win. You remember. It's one thing to be a Christian when you're 17 or 18, and boy, you're going to conquer the world. And as you get older, you're like, man, I'm just tired. I'm just tired. You get out of shape. The very ideal of running a race just wears you out. You'd be happy with second place or 50th place. You just, And there's a lot of Christians exactly in that position today. It all sounded so bright and cheerful and hopeful when you first started, but then the clear morning sky, I was looking out and I told Tracy yesterday, I said, look how gray it is. You ever see them gray days? A spring day, boy, you can hear the birds and it's good. And then you go out on that gray day and it's like, it's just gray. Everything's clouded over. And in that, the choice seems to be pretending it's still all clear and bright and sunshiny on one hand, and settling for a lone gray afternoon on the other. And that kind of gives you this choice between this artificial continuing childhood or this gloomy, realistic adulthood. In other words, you got Peter Pan on one hand and Eeyore on the other. You know who Eeyore is? Winnie the Pooh. You remember that old donkey? So, Peter Pan on one side. Peter Pan never grow up. Eeyore on the other. The reason I can't simply say the standard things about temptation is that people hear it. They hear it in Peter Pan mode and react to it in Eeyore mode. You'll hear me say that everything is clear cut and there's a straight choice between good and evil. Do this, this is right. Do this, don't do this, this is wrong. You've got to put on the whole armor of God, and you've got to fight the good fight of faith. And you'll go away thinking, that's all good for him, but my life is a lot more complicated than that. So how do we break this cycle? How can we arrive at an understanding of temptation that gets us closer to reality and gives us a sight of what genuine, realistic victory might look like and might feel like it? Because, I've seen so many people, we got the victory of Christ. What does that really look like? What does it feel like? Because you sure don't, you're in Peter Pan mode, but then you talk Eeyore, and what really is the victory? I'm challenging people. The truth will make you free. What is really freedom? Do you really have a life of freedom? Because if we're going to follow Jesus, we're going to meet with these temptations, right? You can't help it. Follow him or not, you're met with it. So how can we get to grips with the things that prevent us from following Jesus as in our heart of hearts that we want to? Really want to, but then what happens? Eeyore, man, that's... And there's 3 points I want to, get to the heart of it. And you got to hear me here. And the first one is temptation. And that's the reason I say we got to get this in the right context. Because I know to most Christians, temptation would be, this Christian over here is wanting to really go to the bar. No. Temptation always takes as its starting point something which is in itself good. Always takes as its starting point something which is in itself good. The dualistic vision of the world where things are divided into bad and good, that's not going to do. And now, there is a distinction between good and evil, but we can never get at it by expressing it in terms of different parts of the created world, because we've got to remember God made everything good. Can't go away from that. Do we believe that God made chocolate? In a roundabout way? Yeah, he invented. Honestly, right? Do you think that God said, you know what, if I put this down there, they'll probably make Reese cups out of it, and I can't have them eating Reese cups. They eat Reese cups, it's going to be... God made these things, and God made things, and you know what? He gave us senses to enjoy them, to enjoy the smell of flowers, to hear the birds singing, to feel the warmth of the sun on your skin, to taste whatever food it is that you like. I was watching this guy yesterday, and some barbecue. He's a big man, and he'd had this plate, and he'd take a big old bite of them collard greens, and he'd jump around, and I just laugh because I've never seen anybody enjoy eating as much as this guy did. And I'm sure the Lord is just taking place. In my mind, because the Lord, he's eating them collard greens, and he takes some of that potato salad, and he's eating that potato salad, and he starts looking around, and he said, that's Grandma's tater salad. I was wondering where Grandma is. They must have kidnapped her. I know that's Grandma's tater salad. And he'd take another bite of it and turn around and just, this is a man that is enjoying life. I could just see old straight-necked Christians up there. Oh, my gosh. This guy is enjoying it. So chocolate, these foods, it's a creation of a good and a loving God. Bread, I mean, I'm telling you what, when bread is cooking, I love it. I love it. I'm telling you. All of these things. Be fruitful and multiply. God's idea. One that gets people. I mean, Jesus goes to a wedding and makes 180 gallons of wine. I still hear this one guy on the radio get up there and say, no, he made grape juice. Jesus wouldn't touch alcohol. It's forbidden. God hates it. And I'm like, I'm telling you, he didn't make Welch's grape juice. He made wine. And they partied. And you can go through scriptures now. Is there an abuse of that? We see Noah got drunk. God gave us human emotions like falling in love. And I don't care, we can go biblical all you want. You take that 16-year-old boy and he lays eyes on the girl that he thinks he's going to marry, he's done for. We're talking about them dogs. You can't get his mind out of it. I mean, he's there. And who created that? God made us, right? God, he made us. And these things are so wonderfully important. God gave us a whole book in the Bible about falling madly in love with somebody. I mean, the Song of Solomon, it was so forbidden they couldn't even read it till they were 30 years old or something, God wanted that in the Bible. It says, I'm going to show you this is what it's like. And he celebrated it. Wouldn't it be a bit weird of following Jesus who made all that wine for a wedding automatically meant renouncing alcohol and sleeping with your wife? And there are a lot of people that, real followers of Jesus will announce all that stuff because it's about not having fun. It's about not enjoying life. I mean, really, Jesus comes onto the scene right out of the gate. The wedding. But you see, that's only dangerous talk for a person who's a dualist. Right? Wrong. Welch's grape juice, A serious Christian will realize that sin comes not in the thing itself, but in its wrong use. Not in a part of God's good creation, but in the attempt to use that good creation as though it were our toy or our trash. When faced with this temptation, Christians are often tempted at a level far deeper than the surface temptation. Tempted to hate some part of God's good world, to hate even some part of their own bodies or some part of their own psyche or whatever. Somebody asked, we've had a lot of questions come in, and they're like, well, how should we treat our enemies? That was kind of a roundabout way. Should we pray for them? Because in the Old Testament, David is asking God to, smite them and, all that other stuff. And I said, well, I'll tell you this. If you can show me who God hates, then you have the right to hate them too. Whoever God hates, you can hate. And it's kind of like, well, God so loved the world. Well, okay, so now that we got us a launching point. But often tempted to hate some part of God's good world, to hate even some part of their own bodies, or some part of their own psyche, their own mind. We're tempted to regard the world and even to regard ourselves like a football game. What do we do with the football game? This is my team. I hate this team. I mean, you see a lot of this. I wonder, I don't know what happened with that 15-year-old, but obviously there was something going on, right? And you know how kids are. They can project, and this is what humans do, is we will project, as we've talked about before, our insecurities, everything that we don't like about ourselves onto you. I mean, that's what we do. We as a human race projected all of our hatred onto Jesus, and he took it. But we still do the same thing. It's not right, but that's what we do. We think, well, I like this about me, but I hate this about me. And you play that game. And when you play that game, you always lose. You always lose. And deep down, you know it. But, in fact, if you guys remember one of our first or second lessons back on Colossians, we saw that it's not that way. Temptation always starts from something which is part of God's good creation. So here comes the point then. What about what Paul would use this term, the flesh? Because I know if anybody good Bible mind, the flesh against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh, and these two warring against another. I mean, how do we always look at that? Man, there's a war going on inside of me. And I understand that stuff, but what would Paul say? Paul would say bringing the body into subjection, would he not? He would say, Paul would say that. Well, bringing the body into, mortify the deeds of the flesh. He would say, So there is something there to that, but again, bring it into subjection, It's got its place, and God made it and was good, and it's made to be in subjection, like we were talking about them dogs, not to rule the roost. It's got its place. And thank God for it, because, it's the way he made us. But when Paul uses these terms in Galatians there, I'm going to go over here to Galatians. And this is, again, sometimes it's difficult for us to think in these matters. Let me just kind of go read here. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified? Just stay with me on these verses here. This is the only thing I want to find out from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? Are you so foolish, having begun in the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? So, in that context, what is Paul talking about there? Are you being perfected by the flesh? Oh, because what does Paul ask? Who has bewitched you? Somebody's led you astray here. And Paul oftentimes would deem those Christians as spirit or in the Spirit, and those other flesh. But what Paul is talking about here is, and when you go read these in chapter 6, I believe it's chapter 6, or maybe it's chapter 5. Yeah. Verse 9, now the deeds of the flesh are evident, Yeah, chapter 5, verse 16 on down right there. But here's one thing to note. When you go read all those things of the flesh, it doesn't mean physical material that Paul is talking about. That's not what Paul means. Paul is not saying this, flesh. Because it could be pointed out here that most of the works of the flesh listed by Paul could be performed by disembodied spirits. You don't need flesh to be angry or jealous or malice, especially pride, spiritual pride. But what flesh means here is not physicality, but it means a human being in rebellion against God. In other words, we're out of place again. That's the key. That's a huge statement. I'm going to read this, Galatians 5:13. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Now listen to what Paul is saying. You were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but serve one another through love. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour, right? Huge statement. It's a human being in rebellion against God. And that's the key. And Paul categorizes and he uses these words. I'm going to go give you one over here in 1 Corinthians. Just looking up some of these words. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, I'll read 14 and 15. But a natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. He cannot understand them because they are spiritually discerned. But the one who is spiritual discerns all things. Yet he himself is discerned by no one. I love how that ends. But we have the mind of Christ. Here's another one. In chapter 3, verse 1, and I, brothers and sisters, could not speak to you as spiritual people, as spiritual, in the King James just says spiritual. Now listen to what Paul is saying. Again, so he categorizes these people as spiritual. I could not speak to you as spiritual, but only as carnal, as infants in Christ. A lot of verses. Let me go back to Galatians here. Chapter 6, verse 1. Brothers and sisters, and I remember these same brothers and sisters that are called to freedom. Now, what is this freedom? Jesus told them, you shall know the truth. The truth will make you free. So it's called to know this truth. You're called to freedom. And then he says what goes in line with this freedom is serving one another in love. Now he says in chapter 6, verse 1, brothers and sisters, even if a person is caught in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual, now remember he says you who are spiritual, he's talking over the Corinthians, are to restore such a person in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself so that you are not tempted as well. I thought he would have said kick them out. But you are to restore them in the spirit of gentleness, looking to yourself so that you are not tempted as well. 1 Peter, you are built up a spiritual house to offer spiritual sacrifice. I just wanted to get that word out there. The temptation which feels as though it's appealing to the real you, to your deepest instincts. You know, as we were talking earlier, Paul would say, mortify the deeds of the flesh, these kind of things. Bring it into subjection, Paul. I'm bringing my body into subjection. But when I say the real you, this is, do you know, I've used this term Gnostics. That comes from the Greek word meaning knowing. Metanoia, Gnostics. This knowing. And these Gnostics were in rebellion against, that's why we have 1 John and a few of the other epistles they were writing into that. And you think, well, that doesn't go on today. Well, it does go on today, because what do people come at us with now? This transgender and all of this other stuff. And so what they really think is, well, you know what? I have discovered who I really am on the deep down in my deepest me. And I realized God messed up putting me in this body, and now I'm supposed to be a girl or whatever it is. So what I'm talking about, this temptation that's appealing to what you think is the real you. Because remember, restore them in a spirit of gentleness. Look into yourself, in other words, so that you are not tempted as well. So this temptation, which feels as though it's appealing to the real you, to your deepest instincts and your longing, is in fact starting from something which is good and suggesting that you elevate that out of its proper and God-given context into a different setting where it'll give you a thrill. Now, you think about these things that I'm saying here. You elevate it out of its proper God-given context into a different setting where it's going to give you a thrill rather than the God-designed satisfaction. In other words, it'll give you a shot in the arm rather than the sustenance that you need for the long journey. And, try to look at it in both contexts, because I can see how it would affect this one community, because now you think, well, God messed up. I was supposed to be a girl, or I was supposed to be a boy, and he put me in the wrong body. So now I've discovered who the real you is, or the real me is. So now I want to elevate that instead of understanding that God made you who you are, and he did not make a mistake, and it's good. So we want to elevate the wrong thing out of its order, so now we get all messed up. And when you do that, well, you know the end results. And then you don't have that sustenance for the long journey. And we forget this is a long journey. Now, I want to shift your minds away from that. Let's get back into Christian context here. What feels like a part of the real you is in fact the habit that we get into of rebellion, of using our God-given world, our God-given personalities, because you know what? I mean, you know right out of the gate. I mean, if anybody that's had kids, you watch their personalities develop, and some of them are like you, some of them are not. Like, where did this come from? I mean, it's amazing, right? God-given personalities, our God-given bodies, as if they were simply ours to use and abuse as we like. Remember, you were not your own. Paul wanted to remind us that. Yes, God gave you that body, but it's not yours. You can't abuse it. He gave it to you, and it's good. And he meant you to enjoy Reese cups and steaks and smell flowers and all that he meant for you. Don't abuse it. And as we do that, abusing it gives us an artificial boost to our waning self-esteem. And the answer to temptation, thirdly, can't be to say that the thing offered is bad in itself. Remember, spiritual, so that we could offer up what? Spiritual sacrifices. The answer to temptation can't be to say that the thing offered is bad in itself. If you go down that road, there's only two destinations. One, for those who seem to be succeeding, spiritual pride accompanied by continuing spiritual immaturity. You will have achieved the goal of living as though parts of you, as though parts of the world didn't exist. It's just not true. That might give you a buzz of satisfaction, but it gives God no pleasure at all, seeing that you're denying His good and wise creation and all that it is. The second destination, now remember this destination, let me go back and say, the answer to temptation can't be to say that the thing offered is bad in itself. Two destinations. That one, the spiritual pride. The second, for those who try but fail, their end result is paranoia, which ends up being self-hatred, which comes along with this sense that you must be the worst creature that ever existed. That feeling that everybody else is all right and I'm a mess. Have you ever seen anybody with that? And see, that's the two destinations. And pride and fear are ugly sisters waiting to greet us down those roads. Pride and fear. The answer to temptation is to find out, sometimes painfully, sometimes over a long period of time, what it is about you that is at the moment out of shape, maybe distorted, maybe in pain. Then you may begin to find out, again, sometimes takes a long time, sometimes painfully, how it is that God longs to help you to get what is distorted back into focus. We would use maybe a term, iniquity. Remember, that was that twistedness. To get what is crooked back in shape. To get what is bruised and hurt back into health. And there's no way around this. It takes time. And it certainly takes prayer. And there's a good reason to think it might also involve fasting. There's an excellent precedent for saying that you'll need help. Wise, spiritual, practical guidance is part of your birthright as a member of the body of Christ. Now think about that. It's part of your birthright. To try to follow Jesus and battle with temptation without realizing that this is really what it's all about is like trying to play football with your feet tied together. To wrestle with temptation knowing that its roots run deep into the person that you presently are is to engage with it realistically. And if you start there, you won't make the mistake made classically by the strict Christians from a variety of backgrounds, the strict Christians, of confusing necessary self-denial. There is a self-denial. With paranoia, self-hatred. Don't hate yourself. I remember listening to this guy preach. And the whole time was, put himself down. I'm no good. I'm nothing. I'm no good. And then deep down wishing he had a gift like somebody else that could preach. And, I just thought, again, these are when things get out of order. So, the temptation, you're a good deacon. Not everybody's called to preach the gospel. We're called to live it. Not everybody's called to stand in the pulpit. It is, honestly, just not. And things get out of order. So then you can go down that road of self-hatred, comparing, and then, boy, you a mess. Something that was good in itself, temptation, and now we're out of whack. So confusing the necessary self-denial with paranoid self-hatred, nor will they be likely to make the mistake made by those on the rebound from the first one, to give up self-denial because you learn to give up self-hatred. And in the meantime, while you're working on the long-term project, which we're on, what about the temptation that creeps up on you before you even get started? The first thing to do is to thank God for making you human, making us people. Of all God's creation, I think we missed this point a whole lot. He made us upright. He made us to be partners with Him in stewarding His vast creation. Imagine the privileges, the birthrights. My goodness. Thank Him for giving us life and all that means. For giving us the responsibility to think and to choose. And the second is to pray for grace to use that responsibility wisely. I go back to the rest home, you're in a situation where she needs to be saved. I don't have something wrote down on my book, turn to page 4 and read this out. Third is to recognize that every moment is a moment when the gracious God longs to give you the good gift of His presence and His love, and has some specific response from you which He longs to evoke. Now think about what I just said right there. Every moment He desires to give you the good gift of His presence and His love, and is looking for some specific response from us. Why is He looking for a response? Because He's a narcissist? No. That which will enrich and enhance our humanness in the way that rebellion never can. See, it's not Him, I'm so mad. That can never give you what this can. And that's what He's saying. Look, this cannot give you the sustenance. This will only kill you. But this can give you what you need for the long haul. So I'm here, and I want to give you this goodness of myself with this, looking for this response. And when we don't get this response and we get this over here, because the temptation is to use this in the wrong way, because I want to build my own self-esteem. What does He say? God knows what you have need of before you even ask. And He's saying you doing this is just hurting you more and more and more. But if you would just... That's why it's so important to follow Jesus in this precise moment, or you're going to miss out. Because this is what Jesus did. Jesus followed the Father, right? The words that I say are not my words. He's following the Father because the Father knows. And often the sharpest temptation comes at the critical moment when God is waiting to bring you around a corner to some unexpected blessing or gift. Now remember, let me say it again. The sharpest temptation comes at a critical moment when God is waiting to bring you around a corner to some unexpected blessing or gift. And in the light of all this, and in the power of the Spirit, make your choice and act on it gladly, giving thanks to God. And if you fail, God's love never fails. Now that love can be grieved, but that love can never go away. And it is that love ultimately that is our chief weapon against temptation. This is the key. Because I wondered, like when I was said about Papa, I mean, what did he give me? He gave me love. It's unconditional. I mean, boom. So what is this cheap thing? It's this love. Love that can be grieved, but love that can never fail, that can never leave us. To know that I'm loved deeply, through and through, gives me the security to reject the ways of pride and fear, to reject the false alternatives of Peter Pan and Eeyore, to choose the way of self-denial, which is also the way of self-affirmation, and to reject the way of self-hatred, which leads not to holiness, but to despair. This is, God made us right out of the dust of the ground and breathe. And you know what? We end up hating ourselves. And we do. We look and to know this love and to act out of answering love is one of the central features of following Jesus. And as we choose, we find, like Jesus in the wilderness, that to our surprise, you go read it in Matthew chapter 4, verse 11, the angels came and ministered to him. And, I think that's neat as we get ready to quit that. Haven't we seen that in the situation with Joseph? The angel came. And Zechariah, the angel came. And to Mary, and the angel came. And to Jesus, and the angel came. What a great God. That's a little bit on temptation. So we will quit with that. Our next lesson on this Follow Me, trying to decide how we're going to go about this, but just to give you a couple things, because we'll probably be back in a couple weeks. We've got the Christmas and New Year's coming up, but we'll probably talk about, and I know you'll think, well, how does this have to do with following Jesus? But we've got to deal with hell. Follow Jesus and talk about hell. Sounds like an oxymoron, but you'll just have to come back. Anyway, we'll quit with that.